tomorrow. So, what's this session about? This session basically is who can we trust? What we're trying to do is engage a bit of a discussion. My role is to sort of moderate that, to try and keep us going along, to try and keep to time. The guys behind me, their role is to try and stimulate some conversation with you. So each of the speakers behind me will spend 5 minutes or so just making a few points, making a few remarks on that topic. And then very much it's over to you. So once we get to you, it's just an open floor for questions. We'll have a couple of roving mics around the room. So depending on what points are raised, if you want to take the subject down to the conversation down a different route, it's over to you guys. So very much an open floor and conversational rather than presentational. So I'll just move up here and then introduce our speakers in order. Firstly, Martin Cullip, who's going to speak to us. Martin is, Martin's consumer and trustee of the New Nicotine Alliance. Martin.
I'd like to start with a little anecdote of something that I came across a few months ago. I got an Uber. It was fairly late at night, and I'd been out with some friends. A friend, we'd been drinking and vaping, and he said, "Oh, I've been vaping too. I've got an e-cigarette." I said, "Oh, that's interesting. What have you got? Let's see it." And he said, "Oh no, I don't bring it out with me. I don't bring it to work." And I said, "Why ever not?" And he said, Transport for London have banned vaping in private hire vehicles, so I can't use it. It's too much of a temptation." And I said, "So what do you do when you go on a shift?" And he said, "Well, I always buy a packet of cigarettes before I start work." Now, if you don't understand why he would do that, then you maybe don't understand how e-cigarettes work. And sadly, if you don't understand how e-cigarettes work, there's a possibility you could work in tobacco control. Because a lot of these policies come about because of misinformation that's been spread mostly by tobacco control organisations. The Uber driver's just fallen foul of a policy of misinformation where Transport for London have obviously picked up on all these stories you hear and imposed a ban. And the fact that this is in his private property as well just makes it even worse. These are some of the recent examples of this misinformation. This is just in the last week or so, because these are regular events, and people will be reading these, the public will be reading these sort of things. In a BBC article last week, I think it was a positive article, but they quoted the World Health Organization with a few desperate excuses as to why e-cigs are bad. And one of them was users replacing the liquid in refillable e-cigarettes might spill the product on their skin, possibly leading to nicotine poisoning. I was tempted to demonstrate, just get a 10ml bottle and smear it all over my arm to prove why this is a bit alarmist. But I didn't bring enough. The European Respiratory Journal recently described vaping as a one-way bridge to smoking. So you've got vaping going up, smoking plummeting, but apparently this is happening the other way around. Two researchers from well-respected universities stated categorically, we don't know yet if vaping is safer than smoking. A US researcher from San Francisco, that some people might have heard of, said that smoking triples the chance of a heart attack, but using e-cigs as well increases it 5-fold. I mean, what sort of information does this send out to people about what e-cigarettes are all about and what vaping's all about? There are some public health people who are responsible. Some have been here and they say positive things, but they're just being drowned out by what seems to be a coordinated effort of misinformation, quack science, doubt merchanting, diversion, all of these things. And consumers need to have meaningful and consistent advice if they're going to make their free choices. And public health at the moment simply isn't offering that. Instead, they're mimicking the tobacco industry that they've always said that we shouldn't talk to because we shouldn't trust them. So if we're not meant to trust tobacco companies back then because they were handing out misinformation, why should we be trusting tobacco control? When we're alarmed at imaginary dangers, how can anyone trust those sort of people? I just think the public, and specifically consumers, should be better served by public health and tobacco control, because at the moment they just can't be trusted.
Cool. A wee round of applause perhaps for that. Our second speaker is Derek Yack. Derek's the director for the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World and has just arrived in this afternoon. Derek.
Thanks. Great to be with all of you. I think the question of who you trust is obviously a deeply philosophical question, and I'd prefer to ask the question slightly differently, and what do I trust rather than who I trust? Because I think all of us would hopefully answer the question the same way, that would inherently trust themselves, their conscience. Ideally, they trust their spouse, their partner, their kids, their loved ones. And I assume most of us trust Clive Bates. But I think if you go beyond it, the substantive question is, what are the conditions required to actually remove trust from the equation and move to what Ronald Reagan spoke about when he was talking about the events right on the border of where we're sitting today, all those years ago, on the eve of the start of massive disarmament. And his response was, trust yes, verify always. And we went on to hear people talking about major changes, transformations, when there's a big risk, a threat to health, a threat to livelihood, a threat to populations, where people don't leave it to an individual person to trust, or even an individual institution. They leave it to structures, science, evidence-based processes that can be verified independently, shared, made public, made open. And I trust those processes. And I think that being here, there are two types of examples I'm seeing which one can start trusting because of the facts and what you can see verified. The first are the lived experience of users. Listening to them, understanding how they can tell you stories about the improvements in their quality of life as they use a range of products, from snus to e-cigarettes to heat-not-burn products, and see that they are actually feeling and perceiving what the data and the epidemiology is then confirming. We have to trust. Listening and looking at the manufacturer's performance and seeing whether they are increasing research and development dollars into harm reduction, closing factories that used to produce combustibles, increasing investments in sales to get people out of the combustible market and into the harm reduction space. Those are facts on the ground. I trust those. And I think our challenge is to say, what are the means and the science and the technology we need to put in place to accelerate that becoming the norm? And I love the Scottish video we saw earlier, because I think it did show us the real dilemma. You saw as they started screaming louder and louder in the lift, saying the same thing the whole time still wasn't going to make a difference. They needed to really perfect a new way of talking to this new disruptive technology if they wanted the door to open or go to the right floor. And I think that's where we're trapped now. We're hearing a lot of people using the same language while the technology has changed. And they need to gain a trust for the fact that this technology can actually bring about the hoped for reduction in harm that ultimately is, I think, what we in the foundation hope to do as we cut into the billion smokers worldwide. Thanks.
Derek, thank you very much indeed. Our third speaker is Louise Ross. Louise is former manager of the Leicester Stop Smoking Service.
Martin. Thank you. Hi, everybody. We were the first e-cig friendly stop smoking service, as most of you know. And in fact, my former team are now saying that they should really be calling themselves a vape friendly service, because they're trying to dissociate that cigarette word, which upsets so many people, or makes people nervous. So now vape friendly service. When we started, I asked my team to trust me because I just had a gut feeling that this would work, that encouraging people to switch to vaping would work to help people stop smoking. We had no evidence at the time, but my team, my bosses, the local authority kind of went along with it. Not all willingly, but they did, and we gathered the evidence. Not in a scientific and researchy way, but grassroots evidence. When we had people stopping smoking and saying, I thought I'd tried everything, and when I tried this, it was a revelation. And the more we heard that, the more encouraged people were, and the braver we were in terms of spreading it out to other groups, people with poor mental health, pregnant women. And if I had to choose an organisation, say, in the UK that I would say you can trust, I'd say the National Centre for Smoking Cessation and Training. Firstly, because it goes with the evidence. You know, it looks at what PHE have produced, Royal College of Physicians, you know, other organisations that have actually done the research, Cancer Research UK, but they have an intention to facilitate vaping, you know, against the opposition. And just as a very quick example, you know, we get calls from Stop Smoking Services who say, what do I do about this GP who's just diagnosed one of my patients with popcorn lung? Not through biopsy, just because he sat opposite her and thought, you've got popcorn lung because you vape. So he told her to stop, so she goes back to smoking. And it's those sort of like, you know, infuriating things that we're battling with. But the biggest thing about NCSCT is that we involve people with lived experience. So there's an absolute 100% commitment to work with New Nicotine Alliance and to, you know, the films that have been showing today, you know, include vapers with different opinions. You know, they don't even, you know, imagine that all vapers think the same. They acknowledge that there's big differences, and that's why I think they can be trusted.
Thank you very much, Louise. Thank you. We'll just keep moving along, and then we'll open it up for questions thereafter. But our fourth speaker is Leigh Oyler, who is part of the legal team with Reynolds America Incorporated.
Thank you. Congratulations to the organizers for such a fantastic conference, and thank you too for the invitation to appear here today. I've got 3 points about trust. The first one is that a lack of trust has led to a lack of a real dialogue. This is actually the biggest challenge I think I've found in working in harm reduction policy, especially coming from within the industry. The lingering effects of the tobacco wars have left distrust on both sides, and those within tobacco control who are often the first to call for a dialogue, ironically, often the first to refuse to talk to somebody like myself. And to be fair, there is still some distrust within the industry for certain members of public health as well. We need to change this dynamic, and I think the best way that I've found when I go out and engage with people is to connect with people on a personal level. So let me do that a little bit today. I'm a wife, I'm a mother of 3 little girls under the age of 5, so I don't get nearly enough sleep. Before I came to Reynolds, I worked as both a mediator and a prosecutor with troubled youth. And in that work, I definitely found that there are rarely black and white solutions to major problems. This is part of why I personally support harm reduction in other contexts, whether it is sex, drugs, alcohol, or nicotine. Telling people just to stop it doesn't usually work. And as my colleague Joe Gitchell noted this morning, there are still some fundamental questions about the role of nicotine and the incumbent industry and society that we need to address. So, how do we move forward on those questions? As a mediator, it was my job to bring together people who didn't like each other, didn't agree with each other, sometimes flat out hated each other, and to get them to come to a consensus on an important issue. Developing a personal connection with all of the stakeholders in this world is going to be really, really hard. And so I'm not sure how we begin to build trust on that bigger scale. But I am an optimist like Joe, and so I do keep working towards it. Because I think that the industry has a fundamental role to play in shifting consumer behavior. And I think it's going to take all the stakeholders working together towards that same goal to make it happen. The second point I want to make is a point that's been made often throughout this conference, which is that consumers are not getting information from sources that they trust. I am fortunate to work in an environment where I have ready access to alternatives, and more importantly, I've been armed with harm reduction information that allows me to make better decisions about the nicotine that I choose to consume. Interestingly, in our corporate cafeteria, where a host of potentially reduced risk products are sold alongside of combustibles, where employees are better educated when it comes to relative risks than the general population, and where we have internal policies that actually encourage migration away from cigarettes, the sale of non-combustible products outstrips the sale of cigarettes 2 to 1. So imagine if that shift happened in retail. Governments and public health have made great strides in the past 50 years through cessation and prevention initiatives, but many people remain smokers. And I think that these smokers would benefit from having relative risk information in front of them. I have family members and friends who smoke, and when I try to talk to them, I mean, I'm an advocate, this is what I do, right? When I try to talk to them about these things, It is so disheartening to hear the misconceptions that they have about nicotine and about tobacco. People don't know there's a harm reduction opportunity because they think nicotine is the sole source of harm when it comes to smoking. And unfortunately, these same tobacco control and public health campaigns that have been so successful in reducing smoking have only served to perpetuate those misunderstandings. So whose role should this be then, given all the lack of trust that's out there? At this time, despite the clear articulation from the Food and Drug Administration that there is in fact a risk continuum for tobacco products, there has not yet appeared a public campaign to make smokers aware of that fact. And the industry, as has been noted today, is restricted in its ability to provide that sort of information about its own products without going through a lengthy and expensive process to do so. Much like seeking a dialogue where I think all of us have a role to play, I think the same thing is true when it comes to educating consumers. We all have a role to play, but I think those roles are going to necessarily look very different depending on who the stakeholder is. So, my third point about trust. I recognize that many of you probably are skeptical about trusting the industry, so I would just ask instead that you watch us. Reynolds American 14 years ago was a cigarette company. That was it, cigarettes. Today, we are the only company to offer a full range of products along that relative risk continuum, including snus, e-cigarettes, tobacco heating products, and NRTs. That is not an accident, right? That's a result of that commitment to transformation that we talk about. And additionally, we are finding new ways to use tobacco to benefit public health. If you were fortunate enough to hear Dr. Jim Figler speak yesterday, you know that our company, KBP, was instrumental in developing the treatment for the Ebola virus a few years ago. And we continue to invest in KBP's ability to find those innovative ways to use tobacco to actually benefit public health. So we're committed to innovation, but we recognize that next generation products entering the marketplace alone, that's not going to be enough to shift population health. I mentioned earlier that we all have a role to play, and ours is also to help consumers understand through that modified risk tobacco product pathway that these products do have a difference. And we've invested the time and the science into that process because we think it's crucial that adult smokers get that information. But one MRTP order is not going to be enough. One reduced product in the marketplace is not going to be enough. It's going to take a diversity of products, a diversity of voices, and a repetition of that message in order to really shift public health. Thank you.
Thank you. And our last speaker is Amy Fairchild. Amy is a historian in ethics and policy and other social policy issues. So, Amy.
So you can always trust that a historian will start with some history. And I hope that you'll trust that history doesn't have to be boring, but I think it's really important in helping us pull down a broad backdrop for thinking about the questions that we're going to be discussing today. And like Derek, I'd like to reframe the question a little bit. And to me, the question's not who can you trust? It is what can you trust, but it's also, I think we have to think about how we've been thinking about trust over the course of a century, over the course of time. And then we need to ask, what do we need to weigh when we're making judgments about what it is that we're going to trust? And so I come to this as a historian interested in ethics. I'm fundamentally a public health paternalist, so in that way, I'm aligned with tobacco control. I believe in the power of law and in the power of muscular law to affect broad social and structural change. But I also come having spent some of my formative years in AIDS and at a Department of Health in a period of time in which we were rolling out needle exchange. So that gave me sort of a fundamental belief in the power of advocacy and the power of social movements, and it left me really understanding the importance of listening to the people who are most affected by harm and by risk, and most profoundly affected by the choices we make as policymakers. So, but to think about the history, I think that there are sort of three broad periods of time that we need to understand as we approach this question. And the first period I would have you think about is the period of from World War II and to early post-war years. And it's really remarkable looking back that was a period in which all kinds of funding were the source of profound distrust. Government funding and industry funding. Government funding was described by some as improper, if not unconstitutional. And the worry was that any scientist who took industry funding risked becoming the intellectual slave of the state. And industry funding was just as tainted. And the worry there on the part of universities and scientists was that anyone who took it would end up being the handmaiden, and I'm quoting again, a handmaiden for industry, and putting the university at risk of corporate control. But the concern was, despite these worries, that the United States, and I am a US social historian, was falling behind in terms of innovation. That we weren't innovating as fast as the rest of the world, and we weren't translating basic science into practice. And so, as a consequence of that, funding became an imperative. And so what you saw from the period in the 1960s and through the 1980s was a great outpouring of funding into the universities. So in the 1960s, that's where you saw federal funding becoming accepted in the form of project grants, not general funding, project grants that were given by peers, not by a bureaucrat, but by your own peer in science. And that was one of the things that made federal funding acceptable. But you also then in the 1980s saw the beginnings of federal legislation that incentivized university and industry partnerships, and industry becoming an enormous source of funding. And then finally, the third period I'd have us consider is the period from the 1990s on, and that's when we really began to grapple with these issues of trust again. So in the 1990s, you saw exposés on the part of some former government scientists talking about the ways in which the federal government itself had been the source of intimidation and manipulation when its own scientists found evidence that didn't comport with some important government policies. And academics, too, began to write about this question, but from the perspective of industry. And you see a very important literature beginning to emerge after 2000, Marion Nestle, David Rogers, Naomi Oreskes, David Michaels, that all documented the ways in which industry had been instrumental in manufacturing doubt. These are some of the things that you've talked about, the manipulation of science, and the systematic intimidation of scientific experts within academia, particularly those who had served as expert witnesses. So this all represents a broad backdrop that we have to think about. And one of the results of this has been an enormous focus on conflicts of interest. And that really since 2000 has not only focused on conflicts of interest in terms of what kind of funding you take, but intellectual conflicts of interest. And I don't know if it was within NIH or within WHO that coined this term, but the idea is that also sort of our own personal history of writing that we bring to the table can represent a kind of path dependence. That we go down a particular path and we need to reaffirm our own fundings. We take intellectual positions, we take policy stances in public, and all of these need to be taken into account. It doesn't invalidate our work. In fact, we come to the table because of the expertise and the positions that we form based on those expertise, but we need to be open and transparent about those expertise. And this interest in intellectual conflict of interest comes from a fundamental understanding that science isn't an objective, neutral process. It's inherently a social process. It isn't conducted in a vacuum, in a cultural or a political or a social vacuum, but rather there are a lot of forces that can lead to sort of path dependency, that we all bring values to the table, that we all are engaged in scientific and advocacy networks, and that these social contexts shape our intellectual agendas. And I think, so for example, if you look at the current debate, it's very important to point out that those who are at the forefront of tobacco control, they came from a context of many years of working on denormalizing smoking, of fighting the tobacco industry, of fighting for smoke-free laws, clean air laws, fighting for warning labels, fighting for tax rates. And as a consequence of that, one of the things they prioritized was children and bystanders. So this set of battles and this set of population concerns is one of the things you have to consider when looking at their perspective. But how different has the perspective been of people who came to these debates, say, from the context of drug control and being concerned with heroin use or the use of opioids. They come to this field with a deep level of comfort with the idea of harm reduction. They come with a commitment to pragmatic approaches. They're sympathetic to those who are addicted, and they don't necessarily see cessation only as being very pragmatic. And certainly they bring an emphasis on self-determination, and they're open to the voices of social movements. And as a consequence, one of their priority populations is smokers themselves. That's where their emphasis tends to be. And I'm personally sympathetic to both of these perspectives, but what I trust is that context helps us to understand the ways in which we frame evidence, the ways in which we advocate for policy, and the kinds of evidence that we value. So I'd argue that at the end of the day, that we always have to think about how context shapes us as researchers. Funding matters, and certainly there's an argument to be made that some funding matters more than others. Tobacco industry funding, alcohol industry funding, food industry funding, we have to weigh that question carefully. But then there are other broader questions that we also need to be asking, and that is for any individual research study you read, we need to be asking the question, and these are the questions that come from history, sort of when and where were the intellectual commitments forged on the parts of those people who wrote that piece? What systems are they or we embedded in? And what kind of peer pressure does that create for us? And what are the values that we bring when analyzing the data? And are we transparent about those values? I think far too often we make the case that the evidence is going to speak for itself, but it's always mediated through values. So what I want to see is people underscoring the values, their values and assumptions, and owning them, rather than feeling like that's going to make them less scientific, less trustworthy. And in any case that falls at the intersection of public health and industry, I would ask, what kind of credibility do people bring to the table? What kind of population health credentials does somebody bring? So Louise, you made the point that intention is one of the things that you look at. But I think we have to understand what kind of efforts people have made in terms of population health. A core component of trust is the belief that somebody has your best interests in heart. And so in this way, I don't think you can move trust from the equation, but I do think that the experience of folks who have come from tobacco control matters. We need to contextualize it, but they're certainly coming from the perspective of having a deep commitment to the health of populations. So then let me summarize my three arguments. First, there's been a long history of debate about the role of any kind of funding. That doesn't mean all sources of funding are equal, though. And there can be no discussion of trust, I would argue, without the proper contextualization, and evidence alone isn't enough. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm sure you'll agree, ladies and gentlemen, that five very insightful observations there. Just before opening it up, I said in my introductory remarks that my present role, but what I didn't say is that in my previous role, I was the chief executive of an NGO called Turning Point Scotland, who provided services for people with drug and alcohol issues, pretty much based on a harm reduction and recovery-focused approach. So I do have an understanding of some of the themes that emerge here, and one of the motivators of our organisation was very much driven by the lived experience. But we also felt it important to understand our place in the service system, and try and build up positive working relationships with those other stakeholders within the system. And you do need to know your place in the system to understand how the system operates. But you also need critical friends, people to point things out to you when perhaps it's not going so well. I mean, I know that when I go home and see my 83-year-old mum, I think I'm actually looking quite good. She'll say to me, "You've put a bit of weight on, son." So you need someone to give you that critique every now and again within the system that you operate. And there lies the principles or basis of trust, and that is about relationships. So let's open the conversation up a wee bit. You've heard from our five speakers What thoughts or observations or remarks might there be from the floor? Clive?
I just wondered if the panel would like to reflect on an issue that's kind of related to trust, which is accountability. One of the things that the tobacco companies have, and I thought Amy was spot on, tobacco companies have done terrible things in the past, but they've been held pretty brutally accountable for them in court, the court of a public opinion. What happens if people who are notionally on the side of the angels, mislead people about safer products with a view to persuading them not to use them? They come in with intellectual priors that actually distort or are effectively conflicts of interest, or they engage in practices of intimidation, which we have seen some, researchers have been intimidated out of taking money from the foundation. Is there more that we could do to build more accountability into the public health side of this, so that the temptation to engage in untrustworthy behaviours and is kind of contained, and we build trust overall?
Yep. Derek, all for you there first.
Thanks, Clive. Very thoughtful question. I think if you were to ask the question, what is the body of evidence we have about tobacco control interventions tell us about true impact and benefit, where the ultimate goal is to reduce population risk, I think we'd be probably all a little shocked that it works in some countries. Many elements work well, some don't work. But for many parts of the world, the proof must tell us that if you've got 1 billion smokers, whatever we're doing now is not working either at the pace or with the reach that we really anticipated needing. So the question then is, well, who's accountable for that failure, and how do you call them account for that? And I think in all areas of public policy, you don't have a simple answer to that. You don't have an answer to the question, who's going to, in the end, be held accountable in real ways to address hunger or stunting or massive lack of female education. What we do have, though, are the voices of strong advocates, NGOs, private, public voices, to put the data out front, to have the kind of stories out there that build movements, usually outrage, that leads to change. And if you think of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, as Amy was talking about in the beginning, if you think back to the early period of the epidemic, it was the public health officials were really, I think, quite willing to go along with a prevention strategy that they knew was not going to do terribly much, and certainly not going to bring the death rates down in any short time. But it was the activists who said that is profoundly unacceptable. You may not have treatment now, but you better find treatment. And through activism, through organized involvement between people on the ground, the people who really experienced the deaths among themselves, their families, their friends, the unthinkable happened. The pharmaceutical industry innovation cycle suddenly, from going from nothing, became possible, and the pricing structure collapsed. And meaning that in my own country where I'm from, South Africa, I have 7 million people living because of the success of an advocacy movement. I think now we've got the same questions around accountability. Who's accountable for the fact that of the 1 billion smokers in the world, we know, and people in this room know, that we've got the science, the technology, and the capability to actually bring those death rates down far faster than anything we've envisaged through continued measures on the traditional public regulatory approaches, which will slow the epidemic, maybe bring it down gradually, but not tackle the problem in front of us. And again, I would say the people accountable for us are all of us in this room. It starts with every single one of us. I'm thrilled to see the organization of consumer groups starting to have voice and hopefully start doing what we spoke about, and Clive and I actually spoke about all those years ago, channeling the outrage into effective action. We're seeing industry recognizing that the long arc of history means that the combustible cigarette is going to be history, And if we want to go faster, we better get our act together, both on the user side, the regulatory side, the science side, to make it happen. And finally, we've got to take ourselves a look in the mirror and say, are you doing the best you can? And if you actually can make a difference, why are you not making a difference? Knowing that there are going to be, some of you will be harassed for working with us or working with many in industry. I think that cost of harassment and the kind of pressure you're getting is actually not a bad price to pay if you can save millions of lives. And I know many people in this room have had to make some pretty tough career choices to actually say they're going to side with bringing the death rates down, even if it means a very serious impact on their short-term career prospects.
Laura, is there anything, I'll come to you in a minute, Amy, but I'll have a mic here. Is there anything from the industry side that you think you'd like to contribute there by way of accountability?
Yeah, I think, not to get too far off topic, but what came to my mind was consistency. I think that's what I'd be looking for, and I offer you the example of cigarettes per day. I've seen studies published where it's been intimated that should a very low nicotine content policy go into effect in the United States, that it could reduce cigarette consumption by 5 cigarettes a day, and that is enough to justify, at least initially, implementing such a policy. And yet, whenever the same audience is offered evidence that people can reduce their smoking consumption by 5 cigarettes per day by switching to a smokeless product or a vapor product, that's called dual use and it's bad. And that those things can't both be true, right? So I think consistency is what I'd be looking for.
Amy.
So Clive, thank you for that question. I think the question is who is going to hold people to account when it comes to the evidence. And I think it has to be, for a great extent, the people who have been on the sidelines to this point. And they've been on the sidelines for a good reason. I think for part of the reasons that you mentioned, that they know that they're putting their reputations at risk when they move from sort of the peer-reviewed literature to the public forum. And honestly, I've seen it happen on both sides. I think sometimes no matter what you say, there are going to be critiques from the harm reduction folks that you didn't go far enough, that you're just a tobacco control person in disguise, and there are critiques from the other side that you're part of, you're really funded by industry and you're hiding it somewhere. So you really do put yourself in jeopardy. But I think that this is going to be the only answer if more people who have the capacity to say that I'm bringing a healthy skepticism to this question, enter the debate and enter the public arena. And I think that runs counter to just a lot of the training that we've received as scientists and researchers. But one of the lessons I think of history is this is a moment in which the university is expecting to be engaged and is expecting not to stand back on the sidelines, and needs to be translating what we know into practice in the public forum.
Thank you. Martin, was there something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I just want to say, in answer to Clive, I always find it quite staggering that for an organisation or a movement that constantly asks for harsher and harsher regulation of other people, they have no regulator themselves, none whatsoever. Any other industry, you've got a regulator. If you've something wrong with your energy, you've got someone to complain to. So these people are accountable, and they have to. It gives the people the power. It gives consumers the power. But there's no incentive with public health and tobacco control to talk to consumers at all, because there is no power with consumers to report them to a regulator. They don't have to come back down to us. So which is why when consumers do try to engage with these people, they mostly get ignored, blocked, ridiculed, because they're not beholden to us. There's no way we can complain about them.
Okay. Any other questions from the floor? Question, gentleman in the front here.
This is kind of picking up on Clive's point of accountability and kind of where you're going from, Martin, with the idea that there's no regulator. In an awful lot of countries, actually, there is a regulator. It's just not being used. And I wonder if you'd give your opinions. 2 years ago, I asked a question that if you've got scientists and public health figures, many of whom are funded by government, who are willfully manipulating figures and lying about what they're seeing in research and massaging their results. In the UK at least, that's called misconduct in public office. Why is no one being prosecuted?
Derek, give you the easy ones.
Yeah, I think many of us are aware of the speeches, writing, and thinking of Attorney General Miller of the state of Iowa, about to be the longest-serving Attorney General in the history of the U.S., and somebody who's been on every side of the tobacco debate, who, when he was addressing this issue, also made exactly the point you're saying, that many of the federal agencies are now complicit in the disinformation around the benefits of harm reduction, much the same way as the RICO cases were brought against the industry all those years ago. And I guess the back of his mind and the back of other, many of the attorneys general, must be the question of, can you bring a case against a federal agency? And I don't know what the law is, but certainly you can bring a case in the court of public opinion. To do that, though, you need to have access to the media. And the media need to be truly free and open, and First Amendment rights need to be protected. And I think that's the troubling point we're seeing, is that the control of the media by many funding, many aspects of tobacco control, is now becoming less transparent than it should be. Many are unaware who's really writing the bylines of stories about the dangers of popcorn lung and everything else, and exploding e-cigarette and everything that may be damaging. And that is a problem. And the consequence we saw, that's why in the foundation, the very first thing we did was to do a poll in a number of countries to look at what is the extent of crude misconception. And I think for me, the one question which sums it up is the simple question of, does nicotine cause cancer? And the overwhelming belief of every scientific body in the world is no, it does not. And yet we have figures ranging from 40 to 60% of populations as diverse as Russia, Greece, France, India, Brazil, saying it does. And I mention that because that lies at the core of whether you're going to be able to sell a message of harm reduction. It's equivalent to asking people in the midst of an HIV/AIDS epidemic, do you believe that latex causes cancer? And if they believed that it did, condom use would plummet. And one of the greatest contributors to saving lives would be gone. And nobody would be, and there are people who would say, yes, of course there's a risk from these things, but the question is, how substantial is the risk? So what can you do? Well, I'm sure there are legal strategies which are unfortunately going to be terribly expensive. There are many constitutions around the world that have a right to life, a right to health, and a lot of the statements, the misstatements, could be considered to be an infringement on the ability to make a freely informed choice about their right to life and their right to health. Probably in time that'll come. I don't think, though, that's going to be the way forward. I think the way forward is to have a much more effective, much stronger voice of users working closely with those who are sitting on the science to get it out and to break through into the mass-based media and social movements. That's how we've seen all the social changes happen.
Louise, is there anything from a consumer perspective in relation to this notion of power? How much power do consumers have? How much power does...
I think one of the problems is that consumers are misled by the media, for instance, that you only need to have a small study where a bunch of mice are half drowned in liquid nicotine, and then, the media story comes out that, in fact, this can be... they don't even do that step. They translate it immediately in their own minds to effect on humans, and then you've got a story that people are coming to the Stop Smoking services and talking amongst themselves about. In Luton Airport, as I was waiting to fly, got talking to two lads about what I was coming to do here. Oh, e-cigarettes, no, they'll kill you, they will. They told me. Nobody knows anything about them. You'll get popcorn lung. So that misinformation is just churning constantly, and you can tell people the truth, one person at a time, but it defeats me how you actually, apart from what we're doing, we're getting good information out here.
Amy, can we knock heads together? Is it possible?
Well, let me say this. I understand where you're coming from, but I worry about the chilling effect that trying to prosecute someone for sharing their position on issues would have, even if it's exaggerated and hyperbole. I think the only mechanism is to speak out about it. But the other thing I'd underscore is, it seems to me sort of a sub-theme of what we're talking about is fear and alarm and panic. And fear has been an important weapon in the battle against tobacco. I mean, think about the late 1960s, 1970s, when you first began to get the hard-hitting ads that created a sense, I think, of righteous fear in the part of consumers about combustible products. But I worry about the ways I've seen fear used in e-cigarettes. If you haven't seen it, I just wrote a piece in the conversation on Juul, but if you haven't seen the latest Department of Health and Human Services media campaign about kids and vaping, I think it's picking up on fears in the same way that they were used for combustible products, and this is a moment in which we need to step back and question what's a legitimate warning and what's a warning that's based in sort of the business as usual. Decades of a certain type of tobacco advertising, counter advertising, and question it.
Cool. Thank you. There was a question here over the side. Yeah, thank you.
Hi. One question for Derek Yack, if I'm pronouncing it well. I would like to know if you participated in an ongoing legislative process in your country. I think that public discussion is due to finish on 16th of June. And second question is, do you see any other African countries following steps of South Africa?
That's an easy one. The answer is no, I'm not involved in any legislative process. I certainly hope that the people involved in that actually look at pretty good evidence out there about the power of harm reduction and think in terms of how differential taxes combined with government speaking clearly about the benefits in the way we've started to see happen, particularly in the UK, Scott Gottlieb at the FDA, even if they said nothing more than saying that nicotine itself is not the problem, as we've heard over and over again, it's the other constituents, and legislates appropriately. Other African countries also I haven't heard or been engaged, but I do think, having been in WHO for many years, it was striking to really think, how does WHO affect change? Often for good. I mean, many cases, of course, for good. And the power of getting a decision at the World Health Assembly, whether it's rightly or wrong, it can't be underestimated, particularly in the least developing countries, where the human capacity inside a Ministry of Health, the research capacity and the legal capacity is extraordinarily weak, which means that they will rely on the voice, the edict of a resolution. And what we do see now happening is that the current language, if WHO puts out a statement which says that countries may consider the following approaches to regulate reduced risk products, and they could have everything from restrict, ban, tax, whatever, but they use the word may. In a developing country, that'll be read as should, and it'll be automatically translated into law, which we're now seeing in many countries, where you're seeing bans being put in place with no public discourse, with no understanding of the underlying science, and without a serious voice in the country saying the consequence of that means the status quo continues, the deaths continue. And that, of course, is the great fear.
A question up the back here.
I'm Khosi Letlape from South Africa. I'm a regulator. So there is a regulation that is applicable, but it's applicable to individuals, not to groups. I'm part of the Health Professions Council of South Africa, and we regulate healthcare professionals. So if any professional has given bad advice, they can be reported so that they can account for their actions. The doctor that diagnosed popcorn lung and gave advice could have been reported to the GMC, and they would have had to account for on what basis they made their diagnosis and on what basis they gave the advice. So there is a level where people can account, and we're supposed to give people the information so that they can correct information based on science so that they can make informed decisions. So that there's that level of accountability. But part of the problem is that, at least from Africa, our problems are generated by retired public health people and people from OECD countries that could not crack a career in their own country, and they retire to the WHO and they give bad advice. And I think that is the forum that needs to account. And I don't know why the industry, there's an article that says they can't speak to you, but there's nothing that says you can't speak to them. And why are you complicit and silent instead of telling them that some of the regulations that they base are not based on good science? What stops you from having that conversation, even if it's a one-sided conversation, to the WHO? Because the public will pick it up. Just like the public picks up popcorn lung. Once you begin to say your policies are not based on proper information, the press will pick it up. Unless if the industry thinks the WHO is doing a good job.
Martin, how can we spread the evidence in a more impactful way?
Is that on?
Yep.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm always saying that they should involve consumers more. Consumers should be involved more, especially in the areas we know with vaping. Who knows the devices better than consumers? If you want proper information, you want accurate information, get consumers in, talk to them. The EU had the Tobacco Products Directive regulations came in, and they've just refused to engage with consumers whatsoever. So we now have regulations that are just not fit for purpose because they didn't understand the devices they were regulating. They need to get people in who do understand, and this means rather than just top down, they need to go to the bottom, down to where the public are, and talk to them and get the advice from them. And then you might have some better regulations, you might get better information coming out.
Yeah. Derek, is there anything that you would want to add to the point that was made earlier?
I think Kozi's right. I mean, I think that people who are silent are complicit. Simple. If you don't speak out against the fact that there are some aspects of WHO policy which are just frankly being incorrectly interpreted to the world, one which affects the foundation directly is the so-called use of 5.3, one of their clauses, being totally misinterpreted as applying to receiving funding from a US-based foundation with a 5013C status under the IRS that is applying exactly to the law the requirements that the tobacco control community called for people to apply 7-8 years ago, including Mitch Zeller, who leads tobacco control at the FDA, wrote the actual articles saying, if you want to accept funding from the industry to create a foundation, do X, Y, and Z, and listed 8 criteria. Those 8 criteria are part of the bylaws of a foundation under US law. Now, anybody knows anything about US law knows that if you break it, you're in big trouble, particularly if you break an IRS code, which means that we lose our ability to do anything if we go against the independence criteria. So for people then to actually say 5.3 means don't take money from us is wrong. And I just hope people in the audience will actually look carefully at it. And yes, you may get a little bit of disparagement, but actually just ignore that. And if we get enough of you working with us, we'll be able to start turning this tide the way it should.
Amy, was there something you wanted to add before we come to the next question?
Yeah, one of the things that concerns me just a little bit is that when we talk about the correct evidence or the evidence, is the evidence base is quite complex. And the real question is what counts as evidence? And depending on who you are and where you're coming from, you're going to answer that question differently. So if you think about the recent National Academy of Sciences, Science, Engineering, and Medicine report, the NASM report, the question they were asking is how do we inform the research agenda? For them, what counted as evidence was experimental trials and it was longitudinal studies. If you look at the Public Health England report, the most recent in a series, what counted as evidence for that group, which was very policy-focused, was the lived experience of ex-smokers, people who were smoking and using e-cigarettes, but also ecological evidence. And those two bases of evidence can point you in different directions. So I don't simply think it's the case that anybody who is skeptical of e-cigarettes is not looking at the evidence. They're looking at a different kind of evidence for a different set of reasons. You need to understand sort of what that rationale is and where they're coming from in order to judge the use of the evidence.
Thank you. There's a question from the floor here. Excuse me, could you take this mic? Oh, you got one. Thank you.
My question is a slightly different perspective, but in the domain of trust and distrust and mistrust. And I am a student of science myself, and I find that a lot of information is available. Some of them are high quality information, some are not so high quality. Now, for me, to keep in touch with everything that's happening in my field is virtually impossible because there's so much of information available. So what is happening, a point that has been made by several panelists here, that a lot of people don't know what nicotine does and what other components of smoking does. Particularly in India, as Derek also mentioned, a lot of people believe that nicotine is the damaging thing because they do not know. The policymakers also therefore come perhaps out of it or intentionally only read those informations that, or they got only those information which says nicotine is the cause of every problem. So my question was that trust or distrust may also stem from this explosion of information, part of which does not reach or correct information doesn't reach. And I do not know how we can make all these informations, kind of put it in a capsule and make available to every policymaker, to public, and so that opinions can change. And I wonder, I don't know, it's more of a thinking aloud because I struggle every day and I always find that, oh, I missed something. It was so important.
Laura, is it possible to refine the information, the available evidence in such a way that makes it as hard-hitting as possible?
I don't know about that. There is certainly a lot of information out there, and I think my bigger concern with the information is, and I really hesitate to use modifiers around the word science, like sound science or good science. We should just avoid those sorts of words. But I think what I would look for is more fulsome science. And by that I mean, at the moment, a lot of the research, especially when it comes to vape, is abstinence is the baseline. So anything that you're finding wrong with the product, you're finding wrong with it relative to abstinence as a baseline. I think I'd rather see science that says, well, here's what abstinence looks like, here's what vapor use looks like, and here's what combustible use looks like, and better frame those results, because I think that gets us closer to the truth about where these products fall along a risk continuum, and then you see better media reporting that would come out of it, I think, and then better legislation, because all of those things flow together.
Yep, thank you. Louise?
I commend your idea. As we do need a sort of encapsulated, all these are all the truths, but you would still get people coming back to you saying, but they thought thalidomide was safe. And I think that's the big problem, that we're still in early days. So although many of us believe and know that we are talking about something that has no carbon monoxide, no tar, cannot then produce the big combustible tobacco killers. They will still come back to you with, yes, but you'll only know in another 20, 30 years. We can't wait that long.
Derek?
Yeah, and thanks for that, Louise. I think that's, I think we need to think for a public policy point of view, what are the categories of evidence for which we have sufficient information to act now, and act with some degree of uncertainty. And I remind people that there isn't much in medicine that hasn't been overturned over the last 50, 60 years. Researchers have had to say we were wrong. the X didn't work well. There was an era in the 50s where the way of treating heart attacks was doing surgery on internal mammary arteries. That was wrong. It was shown when they did the proper trials. It was not be effective. Think of how we treated ulcers over the years. That is shown to have been wrong. A lot of what we're doing in cancer treatment initially was shown to be wrong. So we shouldn't be fearful of actually taking action when we think on our current best knowledge we're going to save lives, and knowing that that may also be overturned. But let's go through what do we know. I think Louise said very clearly, and I think very importantly, that we basically know the exposures are down dramatically, the exposures that matter, the things that cause cancer, cardiovascular disease, chronic lung disease in particular. They are dramatically down by orders of anywhere, probably most people would accept 90% plus in the full range of reduced risk products. That doesn't mean that the outcomes are going to be down by 90% plus, but let's say they're wrong, really badly wrong, and they're only 50% down. That's a hell of a lot of deaths and premature disease saved. And if it turns out that it's going to be 65 or 70% in 10 years' time, well, by 10 years' time, the kind of product will actually have brought the exposures down by 95 to 99%. As I said, the arc of technology change is never to make products worse and more damaging, whether they're environmental or health products. It's always to reduce exposures. Think of one example of a reversal of a common product out there, whether it's the combustible engine, whether it's the coal power station, whether it's the way we deal with material waste. Never, ever do their things actually go backwards once you're starting the progress of cleaning them up. Then the final question, of course, is what truly works? What is the evidence we know it works? Well, the way you present the data can really confuse people. So when people say cessation products are effective or efficacious, they're using what we call, and not have to use the technical things, relative risks. They're looking at the risk of success in the product compared to a baseline, and they'll express it as saying nicotine replacement therapy are 1.5 to twice as successful in improving cessation. That's kind of irrelevant when only 6% of people at 1 year actually succeed on quitting. They don't tell us the 6%. And this is even in the latest Cochrane review, just came out a few days ago. Nowhere do they actually have data on the absolute risk. So you're left with a sense that there's a 50% improvement. And I'm using these numbers deliberately because many people will think, well, this is just too much complicated numbers. It actually isn't. It's just addition and division and a little bit of subtraction. We need to popularize how to tell the difference between a relative risk and an absolute risk. If we did, all of you would stand up and tell the pharmaceutical industry to stop lying about the population impact of cessation products on the market when they're virtually zero. And instead, look what's happening in the reduced risk product market. We're seeing the greater use of them with absolute levels of risk coming down faster. And I mention that because I think part of the answer to the problem is a better education among the public of some of the really critical measures so that you can read an article which says that nicotine replacement therapy is cost effective and know that it actually is not going to have any impact on a population level.
So it's a process of evolution, and keep your eye on the bigger picture, really. Sorry. Did you want to come back, sir?
Yeah, I was just adding to that, because clinicians also in India, in my experience, personal experience, are so ill-informed about, many of them didn't even know that there was something with reduced risk and e-cigarettes and all, particularly in Tier 2 or Tier 3 cities and smaller towns. And therefore, information coming in some form that can inform clinicians who can translate that to an ordinary person will also be a big help.
Question here, down the front.
Hello, I'm Michael Joseph. By training and by practice, I'm a public health professional. So this has been a great learning opportunity for me here. My question, what are the efforts being made to join hands with some of the other public health harm reduction approaches we have seen globally for certain, especially with non-communicable disease control strategies and programs, and the language we use? Yes, it's important, we have to be specific, but at the same time, to building that alliances with others who might be also interested in similar type of approaches we see with some of the other harm reduction spheres. So what efforts have been made in different contexts?
Yeah. Derek, how do we build alliances?
Well, I think we have the experts in the audience, and I would love somebody like Cozy or Solly from South Africa to give their views. I mean, I mentioned South Africa particularly because the harshness of the AIDS epidemic was seen the worst in the country compared to anywhere else in the world. And when I was recently just doing an interview down there, it was clear they didn't really understand what harm reduction meant in tobacco. And I just very simply said what many of you, particularly in HIV/AIDS, have said, and it was just a very simple line, which is that abstinence is to quitting as condoms are to e-cigarettes. And I think people suddenly got it, that actually we're not going to succeed with abstinence. Abstinence programs have not worked particularly well for HIV/AIDS, for sexually transmitted diseases. Condoms, and there are obviously a whole lot of things, are not perfect. And it's always interesting that the success rate of a condom is about 85 to 90%. So it's not anywhere as good as a high-quality e-cigarette, and yet it's an integral part of public policy. Why are we not using that argument enough? Somebody think about the seatbelt. The seatbelt doesn't stop the speeding of the car, which means you're going to have a lot of deaths, but you're going to bring down the probability of dying and of severe deaths. Again, a very simple harm reduction method. I think what you're raising, and I said I'd really like colleagues to say it, is I think we should be linking arms with people who've always seen harm reduction as the normal activity of public health, and particularly when it comes to complex behaviors where you can't go from doing things perfectly to doing things extremely dangerously. And that affects all of the non-communicable disease risk factors: physical activity, the way we eat and what we eat and how much we eat, alcohol intake, smoking, and there are a range of others. But for each of those, there's a continuum of risk. And we want people to be moving in the best way they can to the lowest risk category as they feel comfortable with. That's the way we'll make progress in NCDs. The problem at a higher level has been that many people still in public health today come out of an era of infectious disease control, particularly smallpox eradication, polio eradication we're on the verge of, vaccines, where there is a dichotomous approach. You either vaccinate and end it, or you don't vaccinate and you continue with the disease. And I think the mindset of the simplicity of the intervention for infectious diseases is still taking time to move towards the nuance, the gray zone, the harm reduction concepts that we need to apply for all of the NCD risks, not just smoking.
Thank you, Derek. And some helpful and interesting analogies also. Is there a point you wanted to add to that, Amy?
So my answer to this question would be context, context, context. It depends on the context you're talking about. So in the UK, harm reduction has been an idea that's been very well received. So in the UK, policymakers have even been able to talk about heroin maintenance. The US is a different story. Harm reduction for anything has been an idea that's been extremely challenged. So we think about the early AIDS epidemics, condoms, abstinence-only education. Condoms were verboten. Abstinence-only education was the way that we went. So needle exchange is still a controversial idea in the United States. I just came from Toronto, where you have safe injection sites. We don't have those in the United States. Methadone maintenance is a controversial idea. Even seatbelts in the United States were challenges and infringement on personal liberty, and there's a harm reduction strategy too. So I think what we have to look at is what's the underlying philosophy of disease causation. In the United States, since the 1970s, it's been personal responsibility. So if we want to promote the idea of harm reduction, at least in the American context, we have to first really successfully challenge the idea that individual behavior, that it's just a matter of personal choice, and that we either make bad choices or good choices. And if we can begin to challenge that notion and understand that our choices are really structurally determined, socially determined, economically determined, then I think we can begin to have this conversation about harm reduction.
You want to make a point?
Quickly.
Okay, on you.
Yeah. I would say that harm reduction in other contexts certainly offers a lot of lessons for us in tobacco. And I would go back to my point number one, that tobacco is often left out of that discussion. Certainly industry is left out of that discussion. I know that there are these conferences in the United States where they talk about harm reduction, and these very progressive ideas are addressed, like safe rooms for heroin, safe rooms for sex workers, and yet tobacco is not on the agenda at all. I mean, there's just no discussion about it. And so I think that's going to have to change before there can be really parity across those different types of harm reductions approaches.
Thank you. We've got 10 minutes left, folks, maybe just under 10 minutes, and I know that there's certainly two gentlemen want to ask a question, so we'll go to the gentleman over here first, if that's all right.
Is there an elephant in the room? There's the often perceived mistrust between parts of the new nicotine industry. The short history of the industry, we've had parts of the industry criticising cigar-like products. We've had parts of the industry criticising open systems. We've got people criticising heated tobacco products. In the UK at the moment, we've got people criticising licensed products. Is that a limiting factor in the category as a whole growing and building trust?
Laura.
Well, I think it's certainly been a barrier in the past, but I do think there's a growing recognition among all parties that it's going to take a lot of different devices, it's going to take a lot of different types of products on the market to really shift smokers. And so if we're all serious about making that happen, I think we should stop poking at all of those other things and point more at the combustible.
Any other panelist members want to?
I think it's a function of how early this development is, that there's nothing perfect on the market yet, but by raising what's wrong with different products, you get a better product eventually. I think it's just part of the development.
Martin?
I'd just say it's something that's inevitable when these are on the market. You're going to get competition between people who are making different products, which we've seen a lot of in the UK. I don't think you can do much about it, really. You can't really harness them. Otherwise, you could sort of end up making things even worse that way. You can't say you all have to support each other's products, because you might take away incentives that could improve the products in the long run. So I don't think there's much you can do about that.
Do you want to come back at all?
I thought the answers from
Laura?
That's exactly what I would agree with. And I think that Louise makes the most valid point, that unless people talk about the category as a whole, forget what the individual products are. It's only through doing that real innovation, and you're absolutely right, Louise, the category's got to be able to continue innovation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. The gentleman over here, he's had hands up for some time. Gentleman in the red first, I think. Yep. Oh well.
Hi. There's a World Cup in football going on, and I'm Swedish. But I don't look forward to the results, and I tell you why. My question to the panel is, how do we fight outright lies? There's a snus trial going on in Luxembourg, in the ECJ, and 1 month before the General Advocate's decision, there starts to come a lot of bad news for snus in British tabloids, saying snus is a drug, snus is poison, and referring to a professor in California, I don't think they use much snus there, saying that it doesn't matter if you fall from the 10th floor or the 3rd floor, the result is the same. So about Sweden now, and other tabloids say snus gives you super performance. So if Sweden wins the World Cup, it's because it's a drug that gives you super performance. And if we lose, they will say, oh, look what we said about snus. So how do we combat such outright lies, saying 1 + 1 is equal to 10? Thank you.
I'm just really disappointed you mentioned the World Cup, because Scotland haven't qualified since 1998, and it's extremely concerning. Is there anything we can learn from history at all, Amy, in relation to lies, mistruths, misperceptions?
Well, I've think I've said when have said the things I have to say in this. I worry about any kind of sort of extreme characterization. Are there any outright lies? Yes, there are. But I think that the challenge for us is always to, again, try to understand where somebody is coming from, why they're framing the evidence in the way they're framing, and approach somebody from with values that they can resonate with. Because my concern is that it's very difficult to listen to the evidence and listen to the bulk of the evidence unless you can connect to somebody's values first and foremost.
Derek?
I think the real tragedy, and I speak as a dual citizen of two countries that never made it into the World Cup this year, I fear that the great snus nations of Sweden and Iceland should not take seriously the fact that probably the country that's banned e-cigarettes, Brazil, will probably make it to the final. Don't read anything into that at all.
We'll have time for one last question. The gentleman with the hat.
Hi, Ash from New Nicotine Alliance Australia. I'm also a founder and a board member of Students for Sensible Drug Policy Australia. I kind of come from that activist space more broadly. The gentleman before asked the first part of the question that I was going to ask about how we relate to these existing AIDS organisations and harm reduction organisations that kind of exist. And I wasn't sure whether it was the right strategy, but I'm comforted by what some people said, that I'm going home to create a tobacco harm reduction resource for my local drug user organisation back in Melbourne, and hoping that I can get that sort of moved around the whole national network. The other question that I wanted to ask was that internationally and certainly domestically in Australia, the conversation about drug use has really shifted in the last few years. In 2016 at the United Nations General Assembly Special Session on Drugs, there was maybe 100 civil society groups there, and they were kind of locked out of the process. And my understanding is that in Vienna next year, when the international drug treaties are re-examined again, that's not going to be the case. They're going to be invited to participate in that process more. So my question is, how much are we utilizing those existing organizations as allies in this particular debate? And if anybody maybe has some interest or knowledge around the Sustainable Development Goals and the way that they're being interpreted broadly around drug policy and the shifts that are happening in the United Nations there, where maybe other United Nations agencies other than the WHO can be more allied to the causes of tobacco harm reduction.
Martin, is that something you could pick up on? No? Derek?
I'll just say this. I think your point about linking the tobacco control and particularly the harm reduction aspects to the Sustainable Development Goals is actually important. And I think you probably understand fully how that is a driving force. It's not like the MDGs, which applied particularly to the least developing countries. The SDGs, and I would urge people here to get familiar with what they are. They are actually starting to gain traction, both in terms of giving direction to what's important, and there is an opportunity to make sure that harm reduction is a key component, but it's also linked to the other elements. Gender is a critical aspect of the SDGs. The importance of Indigenous people is another important aspect. There are many elements that put together could actually be quite a strong way in which the harm reduction community could show that it's listening and it understands how to play in a bigger pond. And then finally, the SDGs are being picked up by the leading companies in the energy, gas, pharmaceutical and related fields as the driving force for how they're going to transform their companies to actually be the bigger contributor to attaining the SDGs. Because this time around, people realize this is not going to come through government aid alone. It's going to come through restructuring the way business addresses health, environmental and sustainable issues together in a way that is actually profitable for business.
Louise, on you go.
Your question is way above my sphere of influence, but what strikes me is that we've all got spheres of influence that may be big and may be small, and if, for example, you can talk to fire officers about the benefits of elderly or vulnerable people vaping instead of smoking, you may be able to reduce locally the number of fire deaths. You know, that there are all sorts of connections. You know, in England we have the CQC, which regulates mental health and other health services. You know, they got on board about how, you know, denying people the chance to vape in mental health hospitals was wrong. You know, and so they've come out to say, you know, there should be the facilitation of vaping for mental health patients, and it's those small things that can make a difference.
I'm going to have one of the roles of a chair, ladies and gentlemen, is to try and stick to time. And I know that we're approaching 5:30. And is there a drinks reception after this, Paddy, or no? So I wouldn't want to hold you back from that. I was thinking there just about timing, and there's a story that I sometimes tell that I was speaking at a conference once, and as a Scot, you find yourself you can talk for the country. You know, Scots are not shy of a few words or two. So. But I had a 10-minute slot, and I was running over about 7 or 8 minutes, and I was getting towards 20 minutes, and I could see the chairperson getting really fidgety and upset and anxious. So I turned and apologised. I said, I'm really sorry, but there's no clock in the wall, and I don't have a wristwatch on. And someone from the back of the hall shouted, yeah, but there's a calendar in the wall behind you. So bearing that in mind, I'm going to try and draw this to a close. Trust is based in relationships, and to build up true trust, you need to show some of your vulnerabilities. You need to expose some of yourself, as do the other parties involved in that trusting relationship. So I guess in many respects, if there's a key message that's coming out from this session, it's not just work on the evidence base and build the evidence base and target the evidence base, but it's about pulling together our collective efforts and working in a collaborative way to make that happen to best effect. So I hope you've enjoyed this session, ladies and gentlemen. I'd ask you maybe just to, as a matter of courtesy, you know, show your appreciation to our 5 guest speakers here. They've done a wonderful job.